/evening. Good times had by all. Good times had by all. Trying to get the camera in a place where it doesn't shake. For goodness sakes. For goodness sakes. How's that? Is it staying still? Yes, it is staying still. Very, very good. Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you with us. Greetings, friends. Great to talk to you today. I've got plenty to discuss this afternoon. The way it works is I have me give opening remarks. I give my opening remarks. My goodness, it's slipping again. Goodness gracious. All right. I give opening remarks, and then from there, after I give my opening remarks, then I do the roll call, and then from there, I answer your super chat questions, and then we're done. And so that's how we'll do it today. So I do have some opening remarks for you today, so be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button, be sure to hit the notifications bell, and remember that the second half of the show is all super chats. All super chats. Super chats make the second half of the show happen. So if you would like an answer, you must send me a super chat. I will give you an answer to your super chat. It may not be the answer that you want, but you will get an answer. You send me a super chat, you will get an answer. So there we go. First the opening remarks, then the super chat questions in the second half. Between that, I do my roll call. That's how this works. So happy Friday to everyone, and happy summer to everyone. So I'll jump into the opening remarks by first pointing out that today is the last Friday of the month of Ramadan, which is very holy to Muslims. And it is the day of Al-Quds. In Islam, they refer to the city of Jerusalem as Al-Quds. And on the last Friday of Ramadan, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Imam Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, called for there to be global demonstrations in support of the Palestinians. So all over the world today, on the last Friday of Ramadan, Muslims are demonstrating against Israel and in support of the Palestinians. And so you have to understand the significance of the date. And as we are speaking at this very moment, the Israelis are raiding the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque located in Jerusalem. It's a very important mosque to Muslims, a very sacred site, and the Israelis are currently raiding it and pouring tear gas into it and shooting people with rubber bullets. That's happening right now. As we are speaking, the Israeli government is raiding a Muslim holy site, probably because it is the day of Al-Quds, because it is a day that Muslims protest against Israel, and because the protest that happens every year on the day of Al-Quds is something that was inspired by Iran and the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Because of that, the Israelis are raiding the Al-Aqsa Mosque right now. I'm sure they'll claim it's because of a credible threat of terrorism or something, but we know what's really going on. This is symbolic. This is letting the Muslim community know that they don't approve of people protesting in support of the Palestinians, and they also don't approve of the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So I just wanted to point out that that's going on. There's something going on as we speak. Progressives, stop being gatekeepers. Gatekeepers. So that's happening, and we should keep that in mind as we proceed with tonight's presentation. Because, I saw that happening. I saw the horrendous video, of the raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's taking place. I know that because of the pandemic here in the United States, there aren't big public demonstrations in support of the Palestinians like there normally would be. On this day, there are some important web conferences happening, and there have been some street demonstrations around the world. Muslims around the world are taking today to protest against Israel, the day of Al-Quds. So that's happening. Be aware of it. Be aware of how the Day of Al-Quds tradition started with Khomeini. Be aware of it. Be aware of it. Now, that And that kind of sets the stage for my remarks this afternoon. I wanted to touch on, there's a lot of confusion, I guess, about what we stand for. Earlier today, I was criticizing one particular socialist communist group on social media, or a couple of them. I deleted those posts. I didn't want to leave them up there. I didn't want to, I try to keep my criticism of different groups somewhat muted. I think it's important to have polemics and disagreements between communist groups, I decided ultimately to remove some of the posts I made earlier today on social media about one particular communist group, or a group of communist groups that have a similar lineage. And those posts, they've been removed. For the moment, that's how it should be done. But at the end of the day, why is it that, arguments between the Communist Party and the Party of Communists and the Party of Socialism and Liberation and the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party and the Democratic Socialists of America and the Independent Socialist League and the Spartacist League and the International Marxist Tendency and the Socialist Alternative and the Trotskyite Platform and the Socialist Viewpoint and the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Progressive Labor Party. And why is it that arguments between those groups are not very important? I mean, they are. They're relevant. And especially historically speaking, they're relevant. But why is it? Why is it that I urge people not to get caught up in the fight between the ISO and the RCP and the QWH and the XYZ, the Fourth International and the Fifth International and the International Committee for a Workers' Fight Back Combat League and the Fourth Communist International Committee League and the Internationalist Group and the Internationalist Committee and the Marxist-Leninist Regroupment and the United States Marxist-Leninist Organization and the American Party of Labor, and why is it that the arguments between those groups are not something I talk about on here very much? I mean, I do talk about it, and it's worth talking about to some degree or other, but why is that not the focus of the conversation here? Why is that not the focus? I used to be really into that. In fact, I was so into it that I annoyed other people. I studied these differences between these organizations excessively. I used to get so many of their newspapers. I got every one of their newspapers in the mail, and I would scour it for interesting articles, and I was paying very, very, very close attention to what every single Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, Maoist, anarcho-syndicalist grouping, what they were saying. And, honestly, I don't do it that much anymore. I mean, I hear about it. I'm a communist on the internet, and I keep up with communist news and communist world events. But why don't I pay as much attention to that stuff as I used to? Why don't I do that? Folks, because in around 2013, 2014, I started realizing that the arguments between those groups were about the same as a group of desperately poor homeless people fighting with each other. I used to start to imagine that there were a group of very, very poor homeless people. They were arguing with each other. One homeless guy said to the other homeless guy, he said, "You are pathetic. I've been begging for money all day. I have $10. And look at you. You've only got $1. I have got 10 times what you have." Another homeless guy says, "Well," he said, "you think you're special because you've got 10 times what that guy has. I've got $20. I've got 2 times double what you have." At the end of the day, all of those people are still homeless. The difference between $1 and $10 and $20 is quite a bit mathematically, but in relevance to the life situation that all of these homeless people are in, it really doesn't matter that much. The guy with 20 bucks is not that much better off than the guy with 10 bucks. And the guy with 10 bucks is really not that much better off than the guy with $1. And seeing them put each other down and insist, well, I'm better than you, or I'm better than you, is a joke. It's an absolute joke. It's an absolute joke. And, as much as, I know people that are in the various groups, and I'm not trying to tell you not to be in those groups. I was in a group for a long time, and I probably would have stayed in it if world events had not gotten to the point that I couldn't do that. But at the end of the day, communist groups in the United States are the political equivalent of those homeless people fighting. None of them have a base among the population. None of them have any chance of ever taking power in the near future. If there were a revolutionary crisis in the United States tomorrow, there is absolutely zero chance that any of those organizations would be capable of seizing the moment and becoming the new ruling party. Wouldn't happen. You could have, an economic crisis and mass starvation in the United States. You could have the government collapse. You could have, and there is absolutely zero chance, no matter how much of a revolutionary crisis, you could have the whole country out in the streets rebelling against capitalism. You could have people rioting in the streets and chanting, "Down with capitalism," tomorrow. And there is zero chance that any of these organizations would be capable of turning that moment into a seizure of power. I hate to be a jerk about it. That may not be what you want to hear, especially if you're in one of those organizations. But if you're going to be realistic, you have to admit that. You have to admit that. There is no communist group in the United States right now that has any potential to seize power within the next 10 years. You go all over the world. You go to France. You go to Germany. You go especially to the developing world. You go to India. You go to African countries. People will tell you where the communist neighborhoods are. In Paris, there's a certain neighborhood that everyone knows for the past 100 years has been the communist neighborhood. All the seats in the city council are communist run. Still to this day, people refer to this neighborhood as a communist neighborhood in Paris. Right? You go to India, they've got a whole communist region. It's called Kerala. And the whole region is communist run. There are communists in other areas as well. Most major cities in India have 2 or 3 communist districts in them. Right? You go to Africa, any major city, you ask people, where's the communist neighborhood in this city? And they'll tell you. You go to Latin America, Argentina, Chile, you ask, where's the communist neighborhood in Buenos Aires? They'll tell you. And even when those cities were brutal military dictatorships, and it was illegal to be a communist. Hey, there we go. Even when those cities were brutal military dictatorships during the 1980s and 70s, you could still tell where the communist neighborhoods were. People, if they handed out leaflets and were going around saying they were communists, they would still be arrested. Oh, European Union. But everyone still knew where the communist neighborhoods were. Everybody knew. Everybody knew. But in the United States, in the 1970s, there was some of this, very little of it. And in the 1930s, Harlem was the communist neighborhood. Both city council seats in Harlem were run by Communist Party members. Peter Cochoni and Benjamin Davis. There were a lot of neighborhoods in Brooklyn, specifically Brighton Beach, that everyone knew were communist neighborhoods. San Francisco, Oakland was communist territory. They even had the Oakland General Strike in 1948, I believe, or 47. Chicago, there was Red Chicago. People knew the communist neighborhoods, but that's long gone. Communist groups in the United States don't have territory. Communist groups in the United States don't have a base among the population. They don't have sections of the population that are aligned with them. Communist groups in the United States, they generally, if you want to find communists in the United States, there's a couple places you can find them. What I did when I was a teenager is I just Googled them. and I Googled them. I remember there used to be a website. It's no longer around. It used to be called the Red Encyclopedia. And when I first typed in Communist Party into Google, I was shocked to discover that there was a Communist Party in the United States. I was like, wow, I'm not the only person. I figured I was the only person in the world that thought communism might be a good idea, because everyone I'd ever met told me it had been a failure and all of that, and I was starting to get interested in communism, and I found out there is a Communist Party in the United States. I was like, wow. I was just blown away. I assumed that no one believed in communism, but I was wrong. And then I found this website called the Red Encyclopedia, and I found out there's like 500 communist parties, and they all hate each other. And I was fascinated, just fascinated by the whole thing. But, if you want to find communists in the United States, where do you go? Generally go to protests, left-wing protests, and you'll see people selling newspapers. You can find them there, and if there's any left-wing liberal protest, you can generally find communists there. Go to labor union-oriented stuff, stuff associated with labor unions. And you can generally find communists on the margins. They won't be in the leadership at all, and the leaderships will, there'll be big American flags, and they're not, but on the margins, you'll find some communist handing out a leaflet or handing out a newspaper. Academia, at your college or your university, go to the sociology department, and you'll probably find one or two people on staff who have read Marx and maybe were tied in with some kind of academic Marxist activism. And thank you, Joshua, for the super chat. Especially if the university has a department of LGBT studies or gender studies or women's studies, you can generally find some old baby boomer who used to be a Maoist or used to be a Trotskyite when they were in their 20s. That's about it. That's where communists in the United States, they're there. They're certainly there, but they're a very small percentage of the population. It's a very, very niche interest. And they really, really don't have a base among the population. They're just kind of this marginal group of people who have this worldview that is very, very, very contrary to the mainstream political viewpoint. You meet a lot of former communists, right? In the 1970s, it was, 70s, late 60s, there were a lot of people that were communists, and communist groups had quite a bit of influence then. I should say they had some influence at that point, right? If you watch the movie Car Wash, it's a movie from the 1970s. It's about, a group of African-American youth who work at a car wash together. It's one of those kind of long, epic 70s movies. There's a scene where the white guy who owns the car wash, his son is a Maoist communist, and he shows up at the car wash with a t-shirt with Mao on it and starts reading from the little red book at the black people who work there, trying to organize them. You watch the movie Network, which is a movie from the 1970s about TV news, how it influences the world. They talk about the Mao Zedong Hour, and they make reference to communist terrorist groups. There's a woman who's clearly supposed to be Angela Davis, it's got the big afro, and she's referenced in it. I'm trying to remember what other movies. There was some knowledge, I guess, in the 1970s that communists existed. At that point, most of the communist groups, the groups that now have maybe 100 or 200 members, back in the 70s, they had 1,000 or 2,000 members. Now they're down to about a couple hundred members. But that was communists in the United States, right? You go back to the 1930s, the communists were a major factor, right? New York City, 2 city council seats, member of Congress from Harlem, who was basically a sympathizer with the Communist Party, Vito Marcantonio. A member of Congress in Minnesota, who was also basically a Communist Party member, and read pages from the Daily Worker into the Congressional Record. The dock workers unions of San Francisco were communist-led. The dock workers, the United Auto Workers Union was basically led by communists like Homer Martin and Bill McKay. And that communists back in the 1930s, they were a huge factor. In the 1970s, they were visible, and they were something people commented on. And nowadays, what's interesting is communists in the United States, it's very interesting. The communist groups are pretty much irrelevant in the United States. I mean, they're even more irrelevant than they were before, right? You look at, I remember when I was first getting politically active, the anti-war protests were big, protests against the Iraq War. And, the Workers' World Party and what eventually broke away and formed the Party of Socialism and Liberation, they were around. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the Maoists, they were around. The Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyites, they were around. Who else was around? I'm trying to remember. The Spartacist League was around, and these groups were around, and they were together. They were functioning. All right, CIA, right. CIA drug stuff. They were around. They were functioning. They were not unheard of. They definitely existed. A lot of those groups have pretty much gone belly up now. I mean, the Spartacist League, from what I understand, they have not disbanded. I was incorrect when I thought they disbanded. There hasn't been a new issue of their newspaper posted to their website since last May. They did have a small leaflet that said, "Don't vote for Joe Biden." So I guess the Spartacist League still exists. But their website hasn't been updated. The Workers' World Party has collapsed. It split three ways, and there's basically there's less than 40 people doing it now, and it's an office in New York City and 5 people in Philadelphia. They kicked out most of their people and all of that. A lot of these groups are barely holding on. They're holding on for dear life and barely exist. But what's weird is that communist ideas are very widespread. Look, I'm on here talking communism every other day. And I'm on here, David Horowitz, we'll talk about him. I'm on here talking communism every day, and you all watch me, and there's thousands of you. A lot of these lives are watched by at least 2,000 people are watching me, and I'm like a tanky. I'm not even, a mainstream lefty. I'm not a bread tube grifter. I'm not a Trotskyite or an anarchist. I'm a tanky. There's thousands. There's more people watching these lives than are in any of these communist groups. And if you get on Facebook, there's a huge amount of people, most of whom are under the age of 30. Under the age of 30. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of people, most of whom are under the age of 30, who are interested in communism. Teenagers, 20 people in their 20s. Marx books sell like crazy. There's a huge amount of discussion about communism in our society. All over the country, people are interested in communism, especially young people. The right wing is calling everybody a communist. Bernie Sanders ran for president talking about socialism. The Democratic Socialists of America, which is a social democratic reformist group, is certainly big and influential. They have a lot of members, and they're big and influential, even though they ultimately reject, socialism. They're for social democracy, but there's a huge amount of interest in communist ideas, right? I mean, Facebook even has political labels. You can pick communist. You can even make a Facebook political logo that says "Communist will win." I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is, Longworn. I just don't know who that is. There's a huge amount of interest in communism. But the communist groups are even less relevant than they were during the Iraq War years, when there was zero interest in communism, when communism was barely anybody was interested in communism back then. So what's going on? Why is this happening? The U.S. economy is collapsing. There is huge rebellions going on against police brutality. There is a huge awareness that capitalism is bad, according to polls. China, a socialist country led by a communist party, is rising around the world. Many people around the world admire China, this socialist country. Socialism is on the move in Venezuela and Bolivia and Latin America. I mean, Peru, the communist movement there is on fire. And among the population, polls show something like 30-40% of young people in the United States say socialism is better than capitalism. 10 to 12% of Americans say communism is better than capitalism. So what in the world is going on? Why is it that the communist groups are getting small and weak and irrelevant, but communist sentiments are growing massively in the United States? Communism as a movement internationally is on fire and growing bigger and bigger and bigger, right? I mean, it's in Latin America, in China, in India. What's going on here? What in the world is going on here? What's happening? Why is this happening? Now, if you are a serious communist, you care about this. You are asking this question. If you're not serious, don't ask this question, right? If this is just a hobby to you, if this is just like a niche internet interest, if you're LARPing, you don't care about this, right? Right? And I'm not telling you you have to care about this. But if you're a serious communist, if you actually want to see the United States transition to socialism, this should be making you go, right? But if you don't care, I mean, if you genuinely do not care about socialism, I mean, don't bother, right? I mean, if you're in one of these little tiny groups, you're definitely not supposed to be thinking about this. You're supposed to just do what the leaders of the group say. And if you're just an internet communist, if you're a third worldist, there's no hope. All white people are inherently reactionary. This is an evil country. You know, I mean, okay, you don't care about this, right? And there is no hope and there's no point. But if you are somebody who actually wants to see socialism come to America, if you want to see the country you live in transition towards socialism, if you actually want to see imperialism collapse, if you actually want to see a whole new society emerge, then you have to ask yourself these questions. Then you have to be wrangling with these issues. If you actually want to see communism and socialism come into existence, if you want to see a whole new society, if you want to see Western capitalism and imperialism dismantled, if you want to see the USA transform into a society where the banks and the factories and the major industries are organized to serve the people, if you want to get rid of all of these problems of unemployment, all these problems of dropping wages and decaying infrastructure and poverty and opioid addiction and the prison industrial complex and the rising low-wage police state and the danger of a new world war and the military industrial complex and wars for profits and driving wages down. I mean, if you care about all of this, right, and you actually want to see it get fixed, not if you just want to complain about it, not if you just want to say, oh, there's no hope, not if you just want to have like a hip, cool, commodified identity, right? Like, I'm a communist. Look at my communist shoes and my communist hat and my communist Facebook, and I am totally communist. But if you actually want to solve the problems, if actually getting to socialism is something you are concerned about, it's something you're wrangling with, you want to see the country that you live in stop being capitalist and imperialist and become socialist. You want to see the problem of racism overcome. Right? You want to see the historic injustices that have plagued this country get fixed. You want to see growth and expansion. You want to see a new opportunity. You want a better life for your kids. If that is what you actually want, then you have to be wrangling with the same questions that I'm asking. You have to be worried about this. If you're honest with yourself, you have to be asking this question. You have to be asking this question. This is a serious question. We are facing a situation that, according to our ideology, shouldn't be happening. According to our ideology, as capitalism and the economic crisis gets worse, and as the threats of war and as life gets worse for working people, and as working people get interested in our ideas and communism, why, then they come together and they form a communist party. And that communist party that they join, it takes power, right? This is how it should work. But right now, we are seeing a situation where things are getting worse. One, the crisis is getting worse. Two, the situation in society, there's rebellions. Three, there's a huge amount of interest in communism. Four, nobody's joining communist groups, and the communist groups are becoming more and more irrelevant and less influential. What's going on? Now, if that doesn't bother you, I can't help you, right? I can't make you care about this. But if you look at the polls, if you look at the economic crisis, if you look at everything that's going on, there should be a huge, massive communist party in the United States right now. But there ain't. There ain't. And why? Why? Well, I wrote an entire book about why, and I formed something called the Center for Political Innovation. The Center for Political Innovation has been formed for the very reason of resolving this contradiction. All right, checks and balances. Checks. It's been formed for the very reason of resolving this problem. The opening essay, the opening section, the majority of this book is an essay I wrote called City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, but I also included a number of other things. I included a number of texts. And the last live, I read to you a little bit from one of those texts. I'm going to read to you a little bit from this text. All right, this is section 3.2 of the We Are City Builders CPI Educational Manual. Report on an investigation of the peasant uprisings in Hunan. All right, this is Mao, 1928. He went to a part of China called Hunan, where there had just been a rebellion among the peasantry. Mao reports back to the Chinese Communist Party about what he saw. This is what he says to the Chinese Communist Party. All talk directed against the peasant movement must be speedily set right. All the wrong measures taken by the revolutionary authorities concerning the peasant movement must be speedily changed. Only thus can the future of the revolution be benefited. For the present upsurge of the peasant movement is a colossal event. In a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make the choice quickly. A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. A rural revolution is a revolution by which the peasantry overthrow the power of the feudal landlord class. Without using the greatest force, the peasants cannot possibly overthrow the deep-rooted authority of the landlords, which has lasted for thousands of years. The rural areas need a mighty revolutionary upsurge, for it alone can arouse the people in their millions to become a powerful force. Now, what is the context of Mao writing that essay? 1928 in China, the emperor of China had long been overthrown. China had become a republic. And the Republic of China was led by the KMT Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, right? I'm sure I'm butchering that. Forgive me, anyone who speaks Chinese. The KMT Nationalist Party was running China. And the KMT was vaguely kind of socialist, right? The KMT movement was started by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and it was based on three major principles: independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. And the people's livelihood was vaguely understood to be some kind of socialism. Many people say that Dr. Sun Yat-sen was inspired by the teachings of Henry George. Other people say Dr. Sun Yat-sen was very much also inspired by Marx. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was a friend of Lenin's, but Lenin would not allow him to become a full member of the Communist International because he did not believe in communism, but he was allowed to be an observer of the Communist International's gatherings. And the KMT nationalist movement was very broad. It had a lot of working class people in it, and it also had a lot of millionaires and wealthy people in it. It was a broad movement to rebuild the country, it was a broad movement to rebuild the country, and this mass movement to rebuild China, based on those three vague principles, was something that the communists joined. They joined this mass movement. And they joined it for the purpose of trying to influence and recruit and win people inspired by this mass movement to communism. You know, Trotsky said that they should be sectarian and hostile to the KMT nationalist movement. However, the prevailing opinion in the Chinese Communist Party was to join the KMT nationalist movement and get people to understand that if you really want democracy, if you really want independence, if you really want to improve the people's livelihood, you ought to become a communist. So in the urban areas, the KMT nationalist party, it had a lot of communists in it. A lot of communists were in it, and the fact that the Soviet Union gave military training to the Chinese Nationalist Army, that also helped. And there was a lot of communists in it. But in the rural areas, the peasantry were very, very oppressed, and they were rebelling against their landlords. And Mao, someone who's originally from the countryside, he's going to the Chinese communists and he's saying the revolution in China is not going to come from the urban centers. It's going to be in the countryside. It's the peasants, the people who've been oppressed by feudalism. They are going to be the powder keg that will spark the revolution. 90% of the country lives in the countryside. The country, China at that point, is overwhelmingly a rural country. And Mao is saying, look, I know we're in the cities where all the centers of power are, but if we're going to have a revolution in China, we got to get to the people in the countryside. And the people in the countryside are angry and oppressed. And they are going to fight back. It's going to happen. So Mao is urging them to get to the countryside. But then what happens? Chiang Kai-shek becomes the leader of the KMT after the death of Sun Yat-sen. And Chiang Kai-shek starts murdering communists. He launches a crackdown on the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese communists are forced to flee to the rural areas. And they flee to the rural areas. And Mao is proven correct. They start building liberated territory. They start, recruiting peasants, and they build this peasant army that eventually seizes power. The reason that China had a socialist revolution was because somebody named Mao, who was a genius, came along and said, the way we're organizing, it ain't working. The revolution's not going to happen in the urban areas. The revolution is going to happen in the countryside. Mao had the brilliance to tell his own party to turn things around, to completely reverse the way they'd been operating. Instead of being an urban party They had to be a rural party. Instead of operating in the cities, they had to get to the countryside. They had to organize the peasantry because that's where the energy was. They had to drastically change the way they were organizing in order to take power. They had to turn things around. They had to reverse their tactics. They had to change how they were operating. Instead of trying to organize labor unions in urban areas, trying to organize within the KMT party, they had to go out into the countryside with guns and lead peasants to kill their landlords and start seizing liberated territory and redistributing land. They had to do something completely different than they had ever done before. If the communists in China had just kept doing what they had been doing all along, China would not be a socialist country today. The reason that China is a socialist country is because somebody came along and said, now's the time to turn things around. Now's the time to go the other way. We're going this way. Now's the time to go this way. That's how the revolution happened. It happened because they flipped. They changed courses. They changed direction. That's how communist movements become successful. It's when they turn around. China's just one example. How about the other country that had a big socialist revolution in the 20th century? The other massive country, Russia. How did the Russian Revolution happen? How did it happen? Well, you go back to Russia, 1900, there were a lot of communists in Russia. You had the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It was a Marxist party. You also had the Social Revolutionary Party, which was the anarchist, peasant liberation party, the Narodniks. You had various groups. But the big Marxist group in Russia, started by Plekhanov, was called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And it was a pretty loose group, right? All you had to do to join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, you had to agree with like 5 points, you had to pay your dues, you were in. No requirements. It was a pretty loose organization. And whenever there was a strike or a protest, the workers would go on strike or the peasants would rebel, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party would show up and they'd say, hey, we agree with you and we're communists. And they were around, they had reading groups, they distributed literature. It was technically illegal to be a Marxist, so they had to kind of be secretive. It was a pretty loose group. There were some newspapers that were privately owned, that were put out by one or two, individuals. If someone was rich enough, they might print their own newspaper that was Marxist. But that was it. It was this loose association. And it engaged in bowing to spontaneity. Taoism. Whenever the masses rose up, they would run behind it. Oh, the masses have rose up. Oh, well, we're communists. We like you. We support you. You should join with us because if you want to rise up. And it was this loose association. And there was this individual by the name of Lenin who really wanted to win. He really wanted Russia to become a socialist country. He really wanted to defeat capitalism. And he was in exile. And he called a meeting of all the big Marxists in Russia who were in exile. In London, they gathered in a whole room of them. And he said to them, if we're going to win, we can't keep operating this way. We need a party of new type. A party of new type. We can't just have this loose association. We need a group of people who give the whole of their lives to the revolution. We need a group of people who are bound together by democratic centralism, meaning that we will make decisions as a group, but once we make those decisions, we all carry them out, whether we agree with them or not. We have discipline. And instead of just having random newspapers, we have an official party newspaper. So we have one unified political line, one unified message to the masses. The meeting took place, and the majority of the people in the room in London agreed with Lenin. Minority of people in the room, Plekhanov, others, they didn't agree with Lenin. And so, in 1903, those who agreed with Lenin decided to join the central committee he was forming for his party of a new type. They became the Bolsheviks, or the majority group. And those who did not join with Lenin and did not want to adopt his party of new type tactic, they became the Mensheviks, or the minority group. And from them forward, there were two Russian Social Democratic Labor parties. There was the Russian Social Democratic Party, Social Democratic Labor Party, Menshevik, and they were the people who were organizing in the old way, loose association. And there was the Russian Social Democratic Party, Labor Party, Bolshevik. They were the group that was organizing in Lenin's new way. And interestingly, as much as Lenin did not use religious language, he was a scientific Marxist and an atheist, as much as he did not use traditional Russian language, the party of new type was a concept that had deep roots in Russian history. In Russia, secret societies have been a big part of organizing. There was the Decembrists, was a secret society that had organized to overthrow Tsar Nicholas I. There were the old believers, right, who had held on to some of the more conservative beliefs of the Russian Orthodox Church, and rejected some of the reforms of the Russian Orthodox Church that had organized as secret societies. Many observers and Mensheviks, they said, Lenin, you're building a cult. This is a cult you're building here, Lenin. This is not a political party. This is a monastic order. This looks like, the friars, the Dominicans, or the what do they call them? The Franciscan brothers or something. You're asking for people to give the whole of their lives. You're asking for all this discipline. This is not how we do things. Lenin said, well, this is what's going to work in Russia in 1903. That's what's going to do. And he came up with this whole method, agitation, propaganda. And it worked. It worked. When there was a revolutionary crisis in 1905, the Bolsheviks intervened and made it way, way bigger. And then in 1917, when there was another revolutionary crisis, they intervened and they overthrew the government and established a socialist country. Left. Okay. Leftism. Ideas. And that's hilarious, inaccurate, anti-communist films. Now, why did the Russian Revolution happen? Why did the Russian Revolution happen? The Russian Revolution happened, at risk of being repetitive, it happened because the communist movement in Russia turned around. The way they were organizing wasn't working. So Lenin came along and he said, we're going to organize in this different way. And it worked. Right? They had to change the way they were operating. They were operating one way, and it was not working. And so they operated another way. They completely changed what the Mensheviks had been doing. Loose association, tailism, wasn't going to work. So Lenin forms his, party of new type, this secret society, this, monastic order, this authoritarian cultish conspiracy group that engages in agitation and propaganda. And it worked. Right? Lenin engaged in political innovation. He knew that in Russia, in 1903, if you were going to overthrow the Tsar, you needed to set up a secret monastic order. You needed to have a party of new type. You needed to have this, revolutionary conspiracy. And so he reoriented the Marxist movement in Russia to organize that way. Mao, in China, he realized that if you were going to have a revolution in China, you had to operate completely differently. You had to go to the countryside and organize the peasantry. You had to capture the peasant anger. You had to build liberated territories and engage in rural people's war. If in Russia in 1903, Lenin had said, hey, you know, the way we're operating doesn't work, and everyone had said to him, you know, Lenin, why are you always complaining about everything? Why are you always complaining? You know, why can't you just trust the leaders of our Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, okay? Like, they've been organizing for decades, and you're just this young guy, and so why don't you just shut up? But we wouldn't have had a Russian Revolution. If in 1927, Mao had said, hey, you know, these peasants, they're the revolutionary energy, and people had said, I think we need to listen to the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, okay? You know, and we need to listen to Moscow and organize the way the Soviet Union did, because clearly they've had a revolution and we haven't. So I think you need to shut up, Mr. Mao, because, you know, they know how to do things and we don't. So we're just going to do it this way, and then there wouldn't have been a Chinese revolution. Folks, revolutions happen. Every revolution in history is preceded, in the lead up to it, by a dramatic change in tactics. Every revolution in history, every time socialism has defeated capitalism, it has been preceded by a drastic change in tactics. Okay. Get out of poverty. Great African leaders. A dramatic change in tactics. One more example, right? Much more recent example. Venezuela, right? 1960s, 1970s, 1980s in Venezuela. What did communists in Venezuela do? Well, they tried to do the Mao thing. They went up in the countries, they went up into the mountains with guns, and they tried to have rural people's war. There are many groups that did this. Maoists, Trotskyites. Venezuela, that's what communists did, is they went into the countryside. They went into the countryside and they tried to do the Che Guevara Mao thing. They tried to seize liberated territories and stuff, and sometimes they made some progress, and sometimes they didn't. And actually, there was a leader of the Venezuelan military who was sent out to fight them. You know what his name was? Hugo Chavez. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that. But Hugo Chavez, as a young man, was sent up into the countryside to fight the Maoists and to fight the Marxist-Leninists and the Trotskyites who were up there in the mountains trying to do guerrilla warfare. Anyway, 1970s, 1960s, 1980s, Venezuela, that's how communists operated. And that's how communists operated in Argentina, that's how communists operated in Chile, that's how communists operated in most of Latin America. And why did they do that? Because if you went into the urban areas in Venezuela, or in Nicaragua, or in Chile, you got killed. Right? Those countries were brutal U.S.-backed military dictatorships. And if you walked around, Caracas, handing out leaflets, I believe in communism, then you were disappeared in the middle of the night and never heard from again. So, you couldn't organize in the cities. So communists, they had maybe secret groups in the cities, but eventually they would go to the countryside and start waging guerrilla warfare. And it worked in Nicaragua, worked in El Salvador, kind of worked in Colombia, not really. They seized a lot of territory in Colombia. Most places they didn't seize very much territory. And that was how communists worked. And they had this thing called the Tricontinental Congress. It was organized in Cuba. It was this organization of guerrilla warfare groups that were, because all these countries were military dictatorships where you couldn't organize openly in the cities, communists were engaging in people's war and in Focoism, right? And they were operating in the rural areas, arming peasants, and there you go. Well, it wasn't working. And then the Soviet Union fell. So no one was giving them guns anymore. right? Cuba used to give guns to all these communists that were up in the mountains trying to fight. The Soviet Union fell, and Cuba didn't have any guns to give them, and the world was changing. The world was changing. The Soviet Union fell, and a lot of these countries that were military dictatorships started thawing. And what did that mean? What did it mean, thawing? Well, having a military dictatorship is not just really inconvenient for the working class, it's also very inconvenient for the ruling class, because military dictatorships tend to represent one section of the ruling class. And if you aren't in with the dictator and his cronies, and you're a capitalist, you're screwed, right? And military dictatorships, the economy is centered around the military. The military dictator decides, what companies get government contracts and what don't. And it's a Bonapartist regime, and most capitalists don't want a brutal military dictatorship. When there's a threat of communist revolution, like there was in Latin America during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they'll put up with it. But in Chile and in Argentina and in many of these countries throughout Latin America, they said, hey, the Soviet Union's gone. Cuba is not sending guns and weapons to these, communist groups. So why don't we open up? Why don't we have free elections? Why don't we have more of a rule by consensus among the capitalist class? So that's what they did, right? Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, these countries started having free elections again. And they started having open parties. The situation changed. The situation in the countries changed. Suddenly, it was legal to pass out communist leaflets in the cities again. One could pass out communist leaflets in the cities. One could run for office in the name of communism, legally. Suddenly, it was legal to be a communist. The military dictatorships were thawing. However, as the military dictatorships thawed, neoliberal economics came in. Those military dictatorships, the way they kept power is they handed out the goods, right? They in order to hold off the communists, they had a lot of social programs, a lot of giveaways, right? They built steel mills, the military owned factories here or there. They gave people stuff, and the idea was, we're not going to have communist revolution, so we're going to protect our own industries. We're going to use protectionism to build up our own industries. We're going to have some measure of economic stabilization to hold off the communist dictator, the communist revolution. Well, 1980s, 90s, the military dictatorships fall, and the elected governments that come in are implementing neoliberalism. They're privatizing everything. And in order to get government, to get loans from the IMF, and the World Bank, development loans. In order to get loans from the IMF and the World Bank, they have to cut the public budget. Every time, they get a loan, a development loan from the International Monetary Fund in order to, fund their country. And in order to get their next loan, they have to cut the budget. They go, they get a loan from the international bankers. They come back the next year, and the international bankers, the IMF, the World Bank, they say, you've been spending way too much money on your electricity. Cut the budget for electricity, and we'll give you your next loan. Oh, you've been spending too much money on your paved roads. Cut the budget for the paved roads. We'll do that. Oh, you've been spending too much money on your sanitation. The IMF and the World Bank were being advised by Milton Friedman and Jeffrey Sachs and the libertarians. And so in order to get your loan, a developing country, in order to get your loan from a Western, from the IMF and the World Bank, you had to implement neoliberal economic reforms. So at the same time that these military dictators have fallen, the kind of populist economic policies of these military dictators are being rolled back, and they're just getting neoliberalism. In Venezuela, all of a sudden, sanitation workers are losing their jobs. All of a sudden, the price of electricity is going up. All of a sudden, there's whole neighborhoods that don't have electricity for weeks. Transnistria don't have electricity for weeks. All of a sudden, there's regions that are the garbage isn't being collected. I went to Ecuador in 1999. I was a 12-year-old child in Ecuador in 1999. And I saw Ecuador in the middle of a financial crisis. my dad, was doing something there and for his job, and so I went there with my dad, and I had never seen so many starving people. Mass starvation. I mean, there were desperately poor people all over the city of Quito, Ecuador. And I had never seen that level of poverty. I didn't know why that poverty was happening. But I do know now. I know why, right? Ecuador had been forced to adopt the dollar as its currency. Ecuador had been forced to cut all the government spending, and at the same time, there had been El Nino, right? These weather patterns that had wrecked the crops and destroyed the rural folks. And the Asian markets had collapsed, right? The Asian markets had collapsed. And as a result, there was a huge episode of mass starvation in Ecuador. Hundreds of thousands of people starved to death or fled Ecuador. I mean, it was a disaster, right? Neoliberalism was creating this economic crisis. In the 1990s, the neoliberal economic reforms. Now, so you have this whole new situation in Latin America. All of a sudden, you can organize openly as a communist. All of a sudden, economic cutbacks and neoliberalism are destroying the economies of the country. Poor people are piling into the cities in order to not starve to death. So what did the communists do? What did the communists of Latin America do? They changed their tactics. Instead of staying up in the mountains with their guns, they went into the cities. And they organized popular fronts against neoliberalism. They built coalitions against neoliberalism. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez ran on a platform of ending the cuts in social spending. He says he wasn't a socialist. He wasn't a socialist or a capitalist. He was for the third way, what was best for Venezuela. And he ran on a platform of stopping the cuts in social spending. They built a popular front against neoliberalism. A lot of millionaires and billionaires supported it. A lot of working class, middle class people did. A lot of Catholic priests supported it. And the communists were heavily involved. And Hugo Chavez got elected in 1999 in Venezuela on a platform of, I don't believe in socialism or capitalism. I am for stopping the cuts in social spending. And he won. Hugo Chavez won the election. And then there was a big mudslide, and Hugo Chavez mobilized the country to go and rescue the victims of the mudslide. And he passed a new constitution for Venezuela that was more democratic and allowed more participation for the country. And then in 2002, the CIA tried to overthrow him, and the military kidnapped Hugo Chavez. But the rank-and-file soldiers and the poor and working people, they poured into the streets, they rebelled, and they freed Hugo Chavez. And a year later, Hugo Chavez announced that, oh no, he changed his mind. He was for 21st century socialism. He started having these daily TV broadcasts where he read from Karl Marx. And he had a cabinet and a government with members of the Communist Party and Maoists and Trotskyites in his cabinet. And suddenly, Venezuela was moving towards socialism. Thomas Sankara. And in Bolivia, a very similar thing happens. Evo Morales, again, a polarization. Are you for the neoliberal cuts or are you against them? And Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, gets elected on a platform of ending the cuts in social spending. And it's a coalition, and he gets elected. Right? And Nicaragua, the Sandinistas come back to power in 2006. Art of War. Right? All of this happened, Bolivarianism, the rise of Bolivarian socialism in Latin America. Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Nicaragua, all of this happened because the communists changed their tactics. The world changed, so the communists changed. Right? No, if what would have happened in Venezuela and in Bolivia and in Ecuador and in Nicaragua if the communists had said, you know what? We organize in the countryside. We organize rural peasant people's war. We do the Che Guevara Foucaultism thing. That's what we do. And someone, the communists had come along and they'd said, hey, we can organize in the cities now. We can go to the cities and we can organize and we could build a coalition against neoliberalism. And what if somebody had said to them, that's not the way we do things. We have been in this group for 40 years, and the way we work in this group is that we organize in the countryside, okay? And I'm sorry, they've had a revolution in Cuba and they've had a revolution in Nicaragua, and so what we do is we organize in the countryside, okay? And that's how we do things, okay? And that's what we've been doing for the last 40 years, and that's what we do. And somebody said, yeah, but see, we could actually build a coalition against neoliberalism, and then we could get elected. Get elected? Lenin said that revolution does not happen through the ballot box, okay? Okay? So you're a revisionist, and we're going to stay in the countryside, and we're going to keep waging our irrelevant people's war, and that's what we're doing, okay? I mean, imagine that had happened. Then you would never have had Hugo Chavez. You would never have had Evo Morales. You would never have had the Sandinistas come back to power in 2006. None of that would have ever happened. Bolivarian socialism, just like Chinese socialism, just like Soviet socialism, happened because the communists in South America and Central America, they turned around. They started going the other way. They were doing things one way, and it wasn't working. So they started doing things another way. That's how revolutions happen. Every revolution in history has been preceded by a dramatic change in tactics. A dramatic change in tactics. The communists and socialists were operating one way, and somebody came along, Lenin, Mao, Bolivarians, and said, we're going to start doing things another way. We are going to actually try to win. We are going to be in it to win it. This isn't a game. This isn't a LARP, right? This isn't an edgy, commodified personality. This isn't a social club. We are in it to win it. And in order to win, we are going to turn things around. We're going to turn things around. We're going to turn things around. Every revolution in history has been preceded by political innovation. People doing things that had not been done before, drastically reorienting their tactics and their methods in order to win. This is just a fact. This is just reality. You can deny it all you want. You can pretend it's not true. I, for a long time, tried to ignore this fact. I tried to ignore this. Believe me, I tried to ignore this. I tried to pretend this wasn't true. I tried so hard to believe that this was not the case. I tried hard. I tried so hard to believe that the political group I was in was going to make it happen. I tried. I really tried. But they weren't going to make it happen. They weren't going to make it happen. Right? They weren't going to make it happen. The only way we're going to see progress in the United States right now, the only way we are going to see political progress in this weird situation where capitalism is in crisis, where the people are in rebellion, but socialist and communist groups are weaker than ever, even though interest in socialism and communism is greater than ever. The only way we are going to see progress is if we change things, if we turn things around, if we engage in political innovation. I've held it up before. We have the educational manual of the Center for Political Innovation. I'm going to read to you. I'm going to read to you another passage from here. There's 2 essays by Mao in this book. One's not really an essay. It's not really an essay, but it's a piece by Mao. It's a lecture that Mao gave to a group of university students. This is what he said. Right? This is what he says to them. He says, university students should start going down this winter. I'm referring to the humanities. Students of natural science should not be moved now, though we can have them moved for a spell or two. All those studying the humanities, history, political economy, literature, law, every one of them must go. Professors, assistant professors, administrative workers, and students, all of them should go down for a limited period of 5 months. If they go to the countryside for 5 months, or to the factories for 5 months, they will acquire some perceptual knowledge. Horses, cows, sheep, chickens, dogs, pigs, rice, beans, wheat, varieties of millet, they can look at these things. If they go in the winter, they will not see the harvest, but at least they can see the land and the people. To get some experience of class struggle, that is what I call university. They argue about which university is better, Peking University or the People's University. For my part, I am a graduate of the University of the Greenwoods. I learned a bit there. In the past, I studied Confucius, and I spent 6 years on the 4 books and the 5 classics. I learned to recite them by memory, but I did not understand them. At the time, I believed deeply in Confucius. I even wrote essays expounding his ideas. Later, I went to a bourgeois school for 7 years. 7 plus 6 makes 13. I studied all the usual bourgeois stuff, natural science and social science. They taught me pedagogy. They taught me 5 years of normal science, 2 years of middle school. All of this time I spent in the library. At the time, I believed in Kant's dualism, especially his idealism. Originally, I was a feudalist and an advocate of bourgeois democracy. Society impelled me to participate in the revolution. I spent a few years as a primary school teacher and a principal for a 4-year school. I taught history and the Chinese language. I taught for a short period in a middle school, and I did not understand a thing. But when I joined the Communist Party, I knew that we must make a revolution. But against what? And how would we go about it? Of course, we had to make a revolution against imperialism and the old society. I did not quite understand what sort of thing imperialism was. Still less did I understand how we could make a revolution against it. None of this stuff I had learned in the 13 years was any good for making a revolution. I used the only instrument, language. Writing essays is an instrument. And for the content of my studies, I didn't use it at all. Confucius said benevolence is the characteristic element of humanity. The benevolent man loves others. Whom did he love? All men? Nothing of the kind. Did he love the exploiters? It wasn't exactly that. He only loved the part of the exploiters. Otherwise, he wasn't able to be a high official. People didn't want him. He loved them and wanted them to unite. But when it came to starving, the superior man can endure poverty. He almost lost his life. Why is he urging the students to go to the countryside? He said, returning to this matter of going down, people should go, beginning this winter and spring, in groups and in rotation, to participate in the class struggle. Only in this way can they learn something. Learn about revolution. You intellectuals sit every day in your government offices, eating well, dressing well, not even doing any walking. That's why you fall ill. Clothing, food, housing, and exercise are the 4 great factors causing disease. If, from enjoying good living conditions, you change to somewhat worse conditions, if you go down to participate in the class struggle, if you go into the midst of the 4 cleanups and the 4 antis and undergo a spell of toughening up, then you intellectuals will have a new look about you. If you don't engage in class struggle, then what is this philosophy you engaged in? He's urging, in the 1960s, he's saying if you really want to be revolutionaries, you need to go to the countryside. And thank you, Old Gringo, for the super chat. You need to go to the countryside. What is Mao saying when he's saying to all these college students in China, go to the countryside, go work in a factory? He's saying get to the masses. He's saying get out of the movement and get to the masses. That's what he's saying. He's saying get out of the movement and get to the masses. The masses are in the countryside. The masses are in the factories. And if you really want to understand Marxism, and if you really want to be an effective revolutionary, you've got to get to the masses. You've got to get to the masses. Right? That this is a science. This isn't a religion. Folks, it's not a religion. This is a science. It's about winning. It's about figuring out how to win. Lenin said that if the conditions change in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. There is no permanent tactical orientation. There is no the way we do things in communism. That doesn't exist. Everything is constantly changing. The universe is constantly changing, and the tactics of revolutionaries is constantly changing. And the goal of revolutionaries is to actually win, to get to the broad masses of people. And as much as there is a huge interest in communism right now, as much as there is an economic crisis, there are millions of people in the United States who have never met a communist, have no clue why anyone would ever be a communist, have no idea what we believe, but they're suffering right now. And they're watching their neighborhoods get destroyed by opioids. They're watching their children grow up without a future. There's a crisis of mental health in this country. The suicide rate is through the roof. There's a generation of young people that have been robbed of the dignity of adulthood and are stuck living off their parents, hopeless, working low-end jobs, feeling like they don't have a future, spending their days playing video games and, looking at porn, disconnected from their peers, not feeling like they have any hope. Their parents are disgusted with them and saying, "Why don't you get your life together?" Their parents who had decent jobs when they got out of high school, could afford a house and a car without even a college degree, they're suffering. All throughout this country, there are working class people that are suffering. And what does this society say to them? Does this society say to them, well, that's because of capitalism that you don't have a future. That's because of capitalism and the breakdown of the economy that you don't have a place and you don't have a decent job. And, oh, no, this society doesn't say that to them. This society says, oh, I'm Jordan Peterson. You got to clean your room. Yeah, you got to clean your room. You got to clean your room there. And you must have a mental illness, I think. We're going to give you some medication that's going to make it even harder for you to get up in the morning. Yes, we are, because you must have some mental illness. There can't be anything wrong with capitalism. This is the greatest country in the world, you see. Can't be anything, wrong with our society that people, oh, no, you just got to clean your room and you got to, stand up straight when you walk. And it's you got to have some personal responsibility. And their family repeats this to them. It says, oh, you got to have some personal responsibility. When I was your age, I had a job and everything was going fine. And they hear it, and every day they just get bombarded with a message. You suck. You failed. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. You're not good enough. Anyone can make it in America. Why aren't you a YouTube billionaire? Why aren't you, the head of Microsoft? You failed. You're not good enough. There is no future. There is no hope. Every day they take out their phone, they take out their laptop, and there's this pessimistic, evil, hopeless message. There's too many people in the world. There is no hope. This is an evil, racist, sexist, homophobic society. Greed is good. Selfishness is the highest good. They're getting poison come at them. They're being taught to hate themselves. They're being taught not to have hope for the future. Their family is on them. Their parents are on them. And they're miserable. They're absolutely miserable. They're absolutely miserable. Their family is telling them that they're a loser and they're a screw-up. The media is telling them that there is no hope and there is no future. There's a toxic social media environment. They're isolated. They don't even get to go to school anymore because they got to stay home. They're alone. They're constantly being told they aren't good enough. They've failed. Now, who recruits these people? Well, if these people are white and male, neo-Nazis recruit them. The alt-right recruits them. The libertarian movement recruits them. What does the libertarian movement say to these people? Well, you're actually Howard Rourke. You're actually John Galt. And it's all because we have social programs for poor people. That's why your life is miserable. It's because we have social programs for poor people. If we just got rid of food stamps, why, you could become a millionaire. And they sit there on their computer, yeah, that's why my life is miserable. It's because poor people get food stamps. Yeah, libertarian, yeah, right? You know, and the libertarians go to these people and they say, you're one of those great men Ayn Rand talked about. It's because of women, and it's because of black people, and it's because of Asian people. That's why you're miserable. And they're like, yeah, I'm a great man. I'm John Galt. And that's what it is. And then they get fed this poison ideology. Stefan Molyneux talks to them and he says, well, Stefan Molyneux, he talks to you and says, well, it's because you're white. You're being oppressed because you're white. See, it's because you're white. Europeans are the best people ever, and you're being oppressed because you're white. And Jordan Peterson says, well, the reason that we're having the problems here is because of communism. America is a communist country already. That's why we have mass unemployment, and that's why the economy is falling apart, because we're communist. And they're getting all these right-wing messages. And they're miserable, and they're suffering because of capitalism. They're angry about all the things that communists should be angry about. Drugs, lack of economic opportunity, economic decline, a lack of a belief in a purpose, a lack of connection to other people, a lack of a community to believe in, a lack of a cause to fight for. They're angry about all the things. All the things. Thank you, Teresa. They're angry about all the things. All the things that we're angry about. We're angry about. But what happens when these people encounter a socialist or a communist or a leftist? What happens when they meet those people? When they meet a communist or a leftist or a socialist, what happens when they meet them? What does the socialist or the leftist or the communist say to them? You're racist. You have white privilege. Your life is too good. You have a too good life. You deserve to be poorer. You're a racist Euro-settler. Yeah, you think your life is bad? Well, I bet it would be much worse if you were a woman or if you were a person of color. You deserve to be poorer. Yeah, you should pay reparations to Black Hammer so they can build a mountain up in a house up in the mountains for no white people like you. Yeah. That's what the left says to these people. All these people are angry, they're miserable, they're frustrated. And instead of the communists going to them and saying, hey, here's the problem, let's solve it, the communists say, you should have it worse off. Your life is too good. You are and is it any surprise that we're failing? Is it any surprise that people don't want to join us? Is it any surprise these people are all joining Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux and the alt-right? Is it any surprise? Folks, we are sitting on a powder keg. The youth of America, the working class youth of America, who have been robbed of a future. Robbed of a future. Zarif Carey. Robbed of a future. They are going to rise like a mighty storm. Just like Mao, I read you what he said about the peasantry. He said the peasants are going to rise like a mighty storm. Well, the youth of America, the working class youth of America, who were told that they lived in the greatest country in the world, that capitalism is the greatest system that has ever existed, they are going to rise like a mighty storm. The question is, how do they rise? How do they rise? Do they rise as white supremacists? Do they rise as neo-Nazis? Do they rise to kill people of another nationality? Do they rise to support Donald Trump? Do they rise to be libertarians? Or do they rise to stand arm in arm with the people of the world? Do they rise to stand against capitalism? Do they rise to build a whole new country on new foundations? Do they rise to dismantle capitalism and imperialism and build a whole new society? Do they rise in solidarity with the oppressed, or do they rise in resentment and bigotry? How do they rise? They're going to rise. They are going to rise. There is going to be a revolt, and it's already happening. We're seeing it in the streets, folks. We're seeing it. It's happening right before our eyes. The revolt, the insurrection, the chaos in the streets, the rage, it's happening. It's already happening. The inevitable revolt is happening. But the question is, what kind of revolt is it going to be? Will it be a revolt to reinforce the problems of our society? Or will it be a revolt to create a whole new society? If the coming insurrection is going to lead any place good, it needs to be led by Marxists. It needs to be led by socialists. It needs to be led by those who understand that socialism is the answer. The coming insurrection, the coming rebellion, if it's not led by anti-imperialists and Marxists and socialists, it will be led by some other force that will make things far, far worse than they are now. If progressive forces do not seize the moment, somebody else will. Somebody else will, folks. Folks, I don't want to live in a societal collapse. I'd like to live in a revolution. I'd like to live in a transition towards socialism. I'd like to live in the dismantling of imperialism. I don't want to live in a societal collapse. Folks, this happened once before. Thousands of years ago, well, 2,000 years ago, there was something called the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was a backward, reactionary empire that was holding back human history. It was beating down nations. It was enslaving people. It was holding back social progress. Easier to convince liberals and conservatives. It was holding back social progress. And the Roman Empire eventually fell. It collapsed. Right? It didn't become socialist. It didn't have a revolution. It didn't move to a higher stage of civilization. It just fell apart. Right? It was an empire that conquered North Africa, from North Africa all the way up into Britain. Right? Gaul, Germany, all these places, the Middle East, huge world empire. But it wasn't sustainable, and so it collapsed. It just collapsed. The Roman Empire fell. Didn't get to a higher stage, didn't change its relationship with the world. The Roman Empire fell. It just fell. It just fell. It didn't have a revolution. Didn't build a whole new... No. The Roman Empire fell. And when the Roman Empire fell, what was the result? Was it a beautiful new society? All the people said, yes, the empire's gone, and they start... No. When the Roman Empire fell, the human life expectancy went down by about a decade. It took Europe 1,100 years, 1,100 years to get back to the population level it had had at the time the Romans were in charge of it. The Roman Empire fell, and as a result, the world became even less stable and even more chaotic than it was when the Romans ran it. It was reduced from empire to barbarism. That was the result of the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell, and the result was historical regression. But imagine what would have happened if instead of just collapsing into barbarianism, into barbarism, Rome had changed. Imagine if the Roman Empire had changed, had reinvented itself, had been reborn on new values. Imagine if the Roman Empire had abolished slavery. Imagine if the Roman Empire had granted Roman citizenship to people throughout the empire, had granted citizenship to the people in Alexandria and the people in Athens and the people in different parts, different city-states. Imagine if that had happened. Imagine if the Roman Empire had started economically developing the countries in the Roman Empire, building up France, building up Germany, building up Palestine, building up North Africa. Imagine if the Roman Empire, instead of disintegrating into barbarism, had reinvented itself to be a more rational, more progressive, and more humane entity. History would be very different. There was only one way that the Roman Empire could have changed that way. There was only one way. Only one way that the Roman Empire could have possibly reinvented itself to be a progressive force in the world. I shouldn't even say there was one way. There was one class, and that class was the proletariat. Rome was the first place in history you had proletarians, working class people, people who did not own any slaves, but did not have any masters. Thank you, Andy. The Roman Empire was the first time in the world that you had proletarians, people who live by selling their labor power. The proletarians are the class with nothing to lose but their chains and a whole world to win. And if the proletariat had seized control of Rome, the proletarians of Rome had somehow been able to overthrow the patricians and the plebeians, they would have freed the slaves. They would have been city builders. They would have been developing cities around Europe and around North Africa. The proletariat was the only class, the only force in Roman society that could have saved Roman society. But the proletariat was too weak. It was too small, and it was too weak. There was no way the proletariat could have taken power in Rome. Rome was the first society with unemployment. It was the first society with homelessness. Slaves are never unemployed. They're slaves. Slaves are never homeless. They're slaves. And Rome, being the first society with proletarians, became the first society with unemployment, the first society with homelessness, became the first society with unions, labor unions, became the first society with strikes. And the proletariat as a class formed a movement for its liberation. The proletarians of Rome organized themselves to fight for their rights. And because this was ancient Rome, it was a spiritual movement. It was Christianity. Right? It was the cult of this Palestinian carpenter who'd been crucified. It started out among Jewish craftsmen from Palestine, spread to the Greeks, the Greek craftsmen and the Greek proletarians. And Christianity in Rome was the religion of the proletariat. The proletarian movement, the world's first proletarian movement, was Christianity in ancient Rome. A group of people who said there is only one God, and his son was a carpenter who fought for the downtrodden and for the poor, who told us to love our brothers and sisters, who told us that all human beings should be loved and embraced regardless of their race or their ethnicity, who said that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Christianity was the first proletarian movement. It was the first proletarian movement. Rome was the first place in history with a proletarian class, and the way the proletarian class of Rome organized itself was with a movement called Christianity. You can read Karl Kautsky, he documents this very well. That within the city of Rome, Christianity was the proletarian movement. Right? Just like the Navy of Rome, they had their cult, they worshipped the god of the ocean. They had the cults of ancient Egypt, and they had the cults imported from Persia, and the cult of the proletariat, the revolutionary movement of the Roman proletariat, was Christianity. And that's a fact. Go and read Karl Kautsky, go and read, in Rome, the proletarians, as they fought for their rights, as they went on strike, as they built orphanages to care for the homeless children, they organized in the name of Christianity. And at first it was only the Jewish proletarians, but eventually they argued that one could be circumcised in the spirit, and it became a religion for all proletarians. The Gospels were originally written in Greek. Greek proletarians, Jewish proletarians, proletarians of all different ethnicities, organized for their rights, fought for themselves as a class, by organizing in the name of Christianity. Christianity was the original proletarian movement. They didn't have science back then. They didn't have, extensive historical data and information. But there were proletarians who were fighting for their rights, going on strike, and organizing to overthrow the Roman Empire. And the way they organized themselves was in the name of Christianity. And we know what happened. The Romans eventually, as their empire started falling apart, they co-opted Christianity. And they vulgarized Christianity in an attempt to save their empire. Didn't work, but they watered down, and they eventually, you had the conversion of Constantine, and they eventually adopted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The religion of the proletarians became the state religion of the Roman Empire in an attempt to save their empire. But it didn't work. It ultimately didn't work. And Christianity had begun as a revolutionary movement of the proletariat, fighting against the patricians and the plebeians, fighting to free the slaves, fighting for a whole new world. When the Romans adopted it, it became a method of trying to stabilize their empire and keep it intact, but it didn't work. It didn't work. But I thought I might end my opening remarks, and then we can get to the super chats, because I've been going for quite a while here. Didn't think it would take this long. I thought I would end my opening remarks by reading to you, just quickly, some of the founding statements. The founding statements of Christianity. This is from the book of Matthew. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him, gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every sickness and disease. And it goes over the names of the apostles. It says, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or any town of the Samaritans. Rather go to the lost sheep of Israel. And as you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, and freely you shall give. Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. And as you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake off the dust at your feet. Truly, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils to be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At the time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but it will be the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly, I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The student is not above the teacher, nor the servant above his master. It is enough for students to be like their teachers and servants to be like their masters. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more are the members of the household? So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, for they cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall on the ground outside of the Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are numbered, so don't be afraid. You are worth many sparrows. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies shall be those of his own household. And anyone who loves their mother or father more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever finds their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And anyone who welcomes you welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will not lose their reward. On that note, folks, now I conclude my opening remarks, and we'll do our roll call, and I'll answer your super chat questions. And then we're done. So names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us? Names and locations. Elias from Finland. Ryan in Oakland. Nate in Chicago. Tom from Minneapolis. Jenny Lynn thinks I'm fantastic. She's in Cincinnati. John in Houston. Cambodia. Warrington, UK. Tristan in Maryland, Mo in Toronto, Nashville, Nassau County, Long Island, House in the house, Houston in the house, Robert in Hawaii, West Sacramento, Cleveland, Australia, the end of the world, Joseph from Puerto Rico, Cincinnati, Jenny Lynn, Alan in Chicago, Kansas City, Missouri here, New York, West Palm Beach, Steve in Michigan, Arturo in Alaska, New York City, Heavy Dukes, Leah in Texas, Leah Nelly in Texas, Neely, Longview, Washington, Miguel in Puerto Rico, West Palm Beach, Vallejo, California, Teresa in Niles, Michigan, Teresa, Longview, Washington, U.S., New Jersey, West Palm Beach, Northern California, Raleigh, North Carolina, San Miguel in Mexico, West Palm Beach, Pomona, California, Denver, Colorado, Adelaide, Australia, Fortaleza, Brazil, Lockport, New York, Arizona, Mesa, Arizona, Brian Schaefer in Illinois, Independence, Missouri, Rachel Martinez, Michigan, love the Christian talk, Caleb Ramiro, and Ophelia in East Los Angeles, very good. Great friends of the show, both of them. West Coast, Mohsen from Iran, Montana, Pyongyang, North Korea, Henry Duncan. You just keep getting better, Caleb says Kinky. Well, you do too, Kinky. We all do, right? Houston, we need more CPI. We absolutely need more CPI. Amen to that. This is for the birds. Hell in Michigan. Caleb, your super chats are waiting for your opinion. Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, Tasmania, Fort Lauderdale, Minnesota, Detroit, Italian communist in the United Kingdom. I wish I was in Havana, Independence, Missouri, Detroit, Daniel in Seattle, Melbourne, Australia, Netherlands, Northwest Chicago, Michigan, Incheon, Korea, Alpha Centuria, Chicago, Montreal, Chaya, good friend of the program, Samuel in Chicago. We are everywhere, folks. We are everywhere. If you're ever in a new city and you see random people, be nice to them because they might also be in our audience. Where aren't we, right? I mean, deep space, Los Angeles, Glasgow, Scotland. We are an amazing community. I mean, where else do you get people of so many different backgrounds, so many regions? Auckland, New Zealand, Detroit, San Diego, Scotland, Florida, Orlando, Wisconsin. I mean, this is Macedonia. I mean, this is amazing. This community that we have built here is amazing. And the ideas that we have centered around it are so unique and so amazing. So amazing. This is utterly amazing what we are doing here. I mean, none of these fake bread tube channels can compete with us at all. What we are doing here is on such a high level. I mean, this is amazing. This is unprecedented. Who has ever done anything like this? Ever. I mean, this is amazing. We are really special. We are really, really special here. And I am so proud of what we have built. We have taken a pandemic, a lemon, we made lemonade. Seriously. I mean, this community has exploded and we're rising. And we are going to translate into a real life movement, a movement to save socialism so that socialism can save America. This is unprecedented. We are the cutting edge. We are the vanguard. We are doing something unprecedented here. No one can come close to this. I mean, I am so excited about what we are going to build. We're going to have a meetup. Some of the close friends of CPI are having a meetup pretty soon. And we're going to have another one on the West Coast. And, we're having our Saturday Zoom calls. And I mean, this is utterly amazing. There's people in Texas who are doing amazing stuff, fighting for the cemeteries. Great. I mean, amazing stuff. There are people in Seattle. We are everywhere. This is an amazing community. And there's a vibrance here and an energy you don't get elsewhere. But anyway, Russian cosmism. I don't know what that is. I do not know what Russian cosmism is. I just don't know what it is. I'm sorry, I don't know what it is. But let's start answering these super chats. How do we get progressives to stop being gatekeepers? What is it? I mean, a gatekeeper is telling you you can and cannot believe it, right? A gatekeeper is like standing at the doorway, approving or disapproving of ideas, right? A gatekeeper is someone who stands in the way. It's a kind of bullying, right? A kind of workplace bullying. If you need something, you have to go through this person, and they go, yeah, well, I don't know if I'll let it through. I'm the gatekeeper, right? That's it's a term that comes up. Healthcare in China. All right. And that is that's what a gatekeeper is. And I think the main thing is we just have to build our movement. We have to promote socialism. We have to promote the Center for Political Innovation. We have to promote our unique city-building tendency. That's what we have to do. That is what we have to do. I mean, no one's going to do it for us. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. We have to do it. We are the ones that have to get it done, right? If we are going to build a castle, we have got to build the castle ourselves. We have got to do it. Stop waiting for somebody else to do it. We got to do it. We have to do it. And I am going to work with people, and we are going to try to save socialism. We are going to try to engage in, political innovation and turn things around so we can actually get to socialism. So there you go. European Union. The European Union. Negative. I am very negative on the European Union. It's been bad for working class people, bad for workers, overwhelmingly. Unfortunately, we know Brexit. A lot of Brexit was coming from a bad place, Islamophobia, etc. But overall, Brexit was a correct thing. The European Union is bad, right? I mean, a United States of Europe is not a good thing, right? And it hurt the working class. It prevented working people's jobs and labor protections. It was bad for the working class. So, yeah, I'm negative on the European Union. Now that the Brits are out of it, I think the EU may have the potential to be more pro-Russian and more Chinese, more pro-China, right? And EU countries especially seem to be friendlier to China. And you got the Nord Stream 2 development and all of that, and the controversy around Nord Stream 2. But overall, I have a negative view of the EU. I don't think it's a good development. I'm for sovereignty, national sovereignty of people. The CIA drug stuff. Well, the person asked about the CIA and crack. There's like 3 layers to this, and we'll just hammer it out. Okay, right? So first of all, Project MK-Ultra was launched in the 50s and 60s, and that was the CIA promoting drug use in the United States. They did all kinds of research and experiments on mainly hallucinogenic drugs, LSD and other drugs. They were experimenting on their effect among the population. Gosh, social fascist. That was the first CIA drug thing. And we know that, Dr. Timothy Leary, the big LSD guru, he had participated in these experiments at Harvard, and there's the electric Kool-Aid acid test talks about this, and that the CIA is largely responsible for the spreading of hallucinogenic drugs in the 1960s and the creation of drug culture. And they did it because they thought it was a mechanism of social control, and it was a way to, to push the USA to be more effective against communism. It would hurt progressive movements, etc. So that's MK-Ultra. That's the first CIA drug thing. Now, I think the person was mainly asking about crack, and what that was about the fact that in Nicaragua, in the 1980s, you had a socialist government in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, and the U.S. government wanted to overthrow them. And the people that were involved in overthrowing them were called the Contras, and they were a nasty, nasty bunch of people, murderers, terrorists, killers. And the Contras were not a fun bunch of folks, and they murdered a lot of Catholic priests and nuns, and there was a huge amount of pressure on the United States to stop funding the Contras, and eventually the U.S. Congress passed a law that the U.S. government could not fund the Contras. So the question became, how are the Contras going to get money when the U.S. government can't directly fund them? And so there were a couple other ways they did it. They had the Unification Church and Reverend Sun Myung Moon and this Native American activist named Russell Means go around raising money for them around the United States. They'd have banquets and fundraisers to raise money for them. People just donated directly. Another thing that the CIA did is it enabled them to sell drugs. The CIA made sure that the Contras, who were heavily involved in smuggling cocaine, didn't get busted. And Gary Webb wrote extensively about this, and that the Contras, the terrorists that were trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, they were involved in selling cocaine, right? So that's that connection. There's one more connection, which is Colombia, right? In Colombia, right, you had the FARC, right? The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, Marxist-Leninist revolutionary group that was fighting the government of Colombia. and they were winning. And it was determined by the West, by the CIA, that and Western intelligence, that you couldn't really defeat the FARC with only the the official Colombian government. And so a network of what they called paramilitaries was set up, and these were not the official Colombian military. These were right-wing armed groups, fanatical right-wing groups. A lot of times they were tied to evangelical Christian organizations. They were set up to fight the FARC. And a lot of the way, in addition to giving them funding and giving them weapons, the U.S. government and the CIA also enabled the FARC, not the FARC, but the paramilitary groups fighting the FARC to sell cocaine as well, right? A lot of cocaine comes from Colombia. Colombia is known as the cocaine capital of the world. And the FARC was the main, the USA didn't want the FARC to take power, the communists in Colombia to take power. So to fight the FARC, the CIA armed and trained these paramilitary groups that were also selling cocaine. And a lot of these paramilitary groups in Colombia were heavily involved in cocaine. So if you want to know about CIA drug connection, MK Ultra, that's hallucinogens and stuff like that. Cocaine, and crack, that's Nicaragua. And then there's also, the paramilitaries in Colombia. All right. David Horowitz. All right, David Horowitz, his parents were leaders of the Communist Party USA. He grew up in a family, I believe they were a Jewish immigrant family here in New York City. He grew up in Brooklyn. His parents, mother and father, were both members of the Communist Party USA. He grew up in communism, went to college, and became kind of a new left Trotskyist. He wasn't a Communist Party USA guy anymore. He was more of a new left guy. And he was hired to be the editor of Ramparts magazine. Now, folks, Ramparts magazine was the big 1960s new left magazine. It supported the Black Panthers. It supported Eldridge Cleaver. It actually made Eldridge Cleaver, made him famous by publishing his prison writings. Ramparts magazine was this leftist magazine in the Bay Area. And Ramparts magazine, a lot of people think it was put out by the liberal CIA. It's not clear who funded Ramparts magazine, but Ramparts magazine was set up, and it was the left-wing, anti-Vietnam War, pro-drugs, Black Panther newspaper in San Francisco. They published a lot of good stuff. They seemed to be sympathetic to China, a little more hostile to the Soviet Union, but sympathetic to China. They supported the anti-Vietnam War movement. They were into Eastern. It was just this hippie magazine in San Francisco. It was called Ramparts. It was like a leftist hippie magazine. David Horowitz was the editor of it. Bob Avakian of the RCP was also a full-time employee of Ramparts, and so was Eldridge Cleaver. And a lot of big names on the left worked at Ramparts magazine. It was just this big socialist magazine in the Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s, Ramparts. And it was, it was everywhere. You could get it everywhere. It was on every newsstand. It was everywhere. Everybody read Ramparts. David Horowitz was the editor of Ramparts. And he wrote a couple books. He wrote a book about imperialism. He wrote a lot of stuff. Ramparts published a whole book of the writings of the Weather Underground. At the time the Weather Underground were blowing stuff up, they published a whole book, Weather Underground Writings, Ramparts. And they were this new left hippie magazine in New York City. And one day they went under, really fast too. They were just everywhere. Everyone read Ramparts, and then mid-70s, the plug got pulled. Very mysterious. Suddenly, boom, the plug got pulled on Ramparts. Bye-bye Ramparts. Bye-bye David Horowitz. And thank you, Wandering Left. David Horowitz had been the editor of Ramparts, and he wasn't the editor of Ramparts no more. So that was it. There was no more Ramparts. It just kind of went away. So that was the mid-70s. Out of the blue in the 80s, a decade later, out of the blue, David Horowitz took out an ad. I forget, was it the Harvard newspaper? It was at some college, some really Ivy League college. David Horowitz bought an ad in the newspaper. So he didn't actually get hired by them to write the article. He actually bought an ad saying that affirmative action was bad for black people. And it was this op-ed about affirmative action is bad. I'm David Horowitz, used to be the editor of Ramparts, and here is why I don't like affirmative action. And then all of a sudden, David Horowitz was back. And '80s, David Horowitz is suddenly a conservative. And he's got this whole story that the Black Panthers murdered my girlfriend, and the Black Panthers had killed his girlfriend, and he hated the Black Panthers, and he had this awakening, and now he's a conservative, and he knows how bad the left are. And, 80s and 90s, David Horowitz is hanging out, and he's hanging out with the neocons. He's a neocon leftist. And he's David Horowitz. And it's kind of weird. Where did he go? He was editor of Ramparts, and then Ramparts went away, and where did he go? What had he been doing all that time? Who knows, right? Maybe sleeping on the beach, or smoking a bong, or who the hell knows what he was doing, right? And all of a sudden, he's a conservative. David Horowitz is a conservative. He's a neocon. He loves Ronald Reagan. He thinks Bill Clinton is a dirty hippie who's tied to left-wing groups, and really, I started hearing about David Horowitz around the time of the U.S. 9/11. 9/11, David Horowitz suddenly becomes like, he's like a left tracker. It's like, all the leftists are terrorists. All the anti-war protesters are all a bunch of communists and traitors to the country. And he knows because he used to be one, and he starts a website called Discover the Networks. It's called Discover the Networks. And it's like tracking anti-war activists and communists, and it's also tracking libertarians, and it like says libertarians are leftists, which is hilarious. And he's David Horowitz, and he wrote like a political strategy book that was like issued by the Republican Party. It was like given to all the top Republicans, called like The Art of Political War. And he went after Ward Churchill, Professor Ward Churchill, was this Native American professor, and he launches campaigns to get professors fired. He thinks that there's too many like anti-war college professors. There's too many college professors that are anti-war. He writes a book, The Top 100 Professors, which I read, and that's how I first heard of Grover Furr, and that's how I first heard of a lot of great academics, I learned about a lot of great people. I never would have read their books if I hadn't read about them in David Horowitz. And yeah, it was just part of the Bush administration. There was this guy who he used to be a leftist, and, he was going after college professors for being too left-wing and trying to get college professors fired. And, that was it. And it was basically, it was more of a psyop than anything. I don't think that many professors actually got fired. Ward Churchill got fired. Some others got fired. But for the most part, David Horowitz was on TV, and it was to scare college professors, right? It had a chill effect. The idea was if you say something left-wing in your college class, a Fox News kid might record it, and you might be on Fox News the next day being attacked by Fox News, so you better do it. And Dust James is absolutely right when he says this is how cancel culture started, because this is really what would happen is Fox News would cancel professors. That's basically what it was. It was cancel culture for professors. And during the Obama years, we heard a little bit from David Horowitz, but he's getting old now. They're all getting old, right? He's getting old. His former coworker, Bob Avakian, is getting old. They're all just getting old. And, David Horowitz, I think during the Trump years, he just became irrelevant. I mean, it's like, what is he going to say now? Now all the right-wing people are believing in conspiracy theories and all the stuff he used to hate the left for, the right-winger, anti-war. He doesn't know what to do. He's a remnant of the past. He's long forgotten. But yeah, he was relevant during the Bush years, and he was relevant as the editor of Ramparts magazine, and that's about it. And he's David Horowitz, and that's David Horowitz. So there you go. Okie dokie. Alrighty. Socialism, checks and balances. Who says you can't have checks and balances in socialism? Who says? I mean, why not? Why not have checks and balances in socialism? I mean, couldn't you have a constitution in socialism that has checks and balances, a Supreme Court? They have a Supreme Court in Venezuela. They have a legislature. They have an executive branch. I mean, socialism doesn't have checks and balances. Says who? Says who, right? Says who? Right? And the American government has checks and balances right now, and it still does all the evil things it does. The checks and balances didn't stop the war in Iraq. Checks and balances haven't, prevented mass deportations. Checks and balance. There's plenty of checks and balances, but the American government still manages to do all the evil things it does. So, there you go. All right, leftism. How does it relate to liberal ideas, drugs, and sex work? Well, my view is that, when it comes to alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, that's personal choice, right? I don't do any of those things, but if you want to smoke cigarettes, you want to drink alcohol, you want to smoke marijuana, that's your business, not mine. And, marijuana should be completely legalized and whatever. I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I don't use marijuana, but whatever, that's your business. Other drugs, while they should be decriminalized, I don't think anyone should go to prison for using cocaine or heroin, or no one should go to prison for using LSD or using crack or whatever. At the same time, that stuff is not good. That's how the imperialists control people. And we should be doing everything we can to provide treatment for people, to help people recover and get over their addiction. And drugs are a scourge on society. They're not good. Now, as far as the sex work issue, we have to be careful how we talk about it, okay? Because for the majority of the people in the world who are involved in, quote unquote, sex work, it's slavery. It's human trafficking. It's slavery. They're owned by a pimp. It's awful. It's horrendous. And also there's a lot of people who go into that out of economic desperation. They don't have options, they don't have opportunities, and they go into that out of desperation. So we should be pretty clear that we're against what the sex trade is for the overwhelming majority of people do it, what is referred to as sex work. For the overwhelming majority of people involved in it, it's a very, very negative thing. And communists can't be going around saying, what do we believe in? We got to be clear. However, and this is where we got to be careful, there are people nowadays who, webcam girls, right? There are people who become webcam girls to make an extra buck. They're female or male, I guess. You can be a webcam boy. They do it, and they're making an extra buck. They shouldn't be criminalized for doing that, right? There are, I think, in like hipster areas, you'll get some, young women who will do that kind of work because they want to. And they feel it's empowering and it's feminist. And if they want to do that because they want to, that's their business. And so we got to be careful. And we obviously don't want to criminalize, webcam girls or criminalize, young hipster middle-class women who want to do this because they think it's feminist empowerment. But we have to be sensitive to what the sex trade is for the majority of people in the world engaged in it. The overwhelming majority of quote-unquote sex work in this world is very, 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 very bad. For a minority of people, it is an option. It is an option that they have engaged in. So we have to be, there's nuance to this, right? If leftists are constantly going around saying, that's what we believe in prostitution, sex, we're going to alienate a lot of working class people. And we're going to be giving a pass to some very, very, very evil things. But at the same time, if there are women who do feel it's empowering and they're not being compelled to do it against their will, they're not facing economic compulsion, it's just something that they feel that they want to do, that's for them to decide. It's not for me. I don't go around telling women, you're not allowed to be a sex worker. I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to say the police should arrest them for doing that. I'm not going to say that, right? I'm not gonna say, no, you are not allowed to be a webcam girl. I, Caleb Maupin, the man, have said that what your options are allowed. I'm not gonna do that. So you gotta be nuanced, right? If it's, you gotta be nuanced, right? That's my position. And I'm sure this is one of those issues that is toxic. I'm sure there are hundreds of people who hate me because of what I just said on either side of the issue. There are sex workers who, because I pointed out, even though they have the right to do it, because I pointed out what it is for the majority of people engaged in it, they're hating me, and I'm sure that there are people who are feminists, who hear me and say, Caleb, how can you be justifying? I'm not doing either of those things. I'm saying nuance. It's a nuanced position. I take a nuanced position. And the sad thing about nuance is that often people can't understand what you're saying, right? People have this emotional response and they don't hear what you're saying. I hear the feminists who say that, look, the sex trade for the majority of women who engage in it is horrendous. And I hear them. And, the commodification of the human body, I hear them. And for feminists who say, look, it's my body, and if I want to use my body to make money and I'm not being compelled against my will, and I hear them. I hear both of you, and I think you're both right, and so it must be discussed in a nuanced way. That's my position. Have me arrested, have me shot. That's my position. There you go. All right. Okay. Hilarious and inaccurate anti-communist films. I don't know. I mean, Dr. Zhivago. What immediately comes to mind is that scene in Dr. Zhivago. There's the old man. He's like, "This Lenin, is he the new czar?" He's like, "Lenin's not the czar, Arthur. There aren't going to be any more czars. Only workers in our brand new workers' state." It's the hokiest thing. Is he the new czar? There aren't going to be any more czars. Just workers in our workers' state. It's the hokiest thing I've ever seen. But yeah, there you go. Another great thing I like is there's a movie called The Red Menace, right? And it's this Italian guy goes to a communist meeting, and there's this like woman who's very like authoritarian. She's standing up there and she's like, "Nothing will stop the march of democracy." And then this like guy who's like a stereotypical Italian. He's got his hair spiked back. He's wearing a leather jacket. He raises his hand. He's like, I've got a question. What's this in our textbook about the dictatorship of the proletariat? I mean, it's not democracy if one class is in charge, is it? And she's like it escalates, and she's like, what kind of stupid question? Why, you're Italian. You must be a Dago, and that means you're a fascist. You're a Mussolini supporter. Take him out. And then they have two guys like grab him and like drag him out of the room, and he's like, I'm just asking a question. What's the question? I mean, it's the dumbest thing. You got to watch it. It doesn't exactly go like that, but it's from the movie The Red Menace. Right? And so it's like the two like thugs take him in the back room, and he's like, guys, can't you see this communism stuff is a lie? It's a lie. They're trying to overthrow democracy. And then they're like, sure, we see, and they beat him up, and they like, and then the headline on the Daily Worker the next day is Italian killed by fascists for being a communist. Like, ha ha ha, they killed him. And then they said the fascists killed him. It's an awful movie. The Red Menace, it's called. It's a 1950s anti-communist film. You can watch the clips from it. And then I think the woman who's the evil communist at the end of the movie, they have her, if I'm not mistaken. She's in a prison cell, and she's like, can you hear them? They're marching. They're marching. Can you hear them? Can you hear them? And it's like, and then I think it cuts away to Red Square, and like this marching thing, and she's in the jail cell laughing. Oh, they're marching, they're marching. And then it cuts away to the Soviet army marching or something. That's some hokey anti-communism. What else? All right, next question. How do urban folks get out of poverty? Well, at the end of the day, we need to fight for a government of action that fights for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families, right? And we need to organize and demand that the government build infrastructure and hire people, build high-speed railway, provide a jobs guarantee, ultimately the way to end the crisis is with construction and is with central planning of the economy, right? Great African leaders. Well, look, Robert Mugabe, he overthrew the apartheid state of Rhodesia. The reason the imperialists hated him was because he was redistributing land. Gaddafi, the person asked post-Gaddafi, his achievements were great. Someone asked about Thomas Sankara, the socialist leader of Burkina Faso. He was the socialist leader of Burkina Faso, still widely loved in Burkina Faso. There you go. I don't know enough about Transnistria. I just don't know enough about it. That is a blind spot in my knowledge. I just don't know enough about it. All right, The Art of War. I have never studied that book, so I can't tell you if it has insights for communists. CEOs. deserve salaries. All right. So I can't tell you. I just can't tell you. So there you go. I just haven't read The Art of War. Zarif and John Kerry. That tape, I've got questions about it, right? So the story is that there's a tape of Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, and he's saying on this tape that Qasem Soleimani is undermining his negotiation efforts. He's also saying that he told John Kerry about Israeli operations in Syria. Now, the thing is, Israel was very open about its operations in Syria. They weren't a secret. But the way this was presented is if it's a big tragedy. But did the USA possibly share intelligence with Iran during the negotiations? Very possibly, right? When two big countries like Iran and the United States are negotiating, especially when they're negotiating something as big as the Iran nuclear deal, would they share information with each other? Of course, right? I mean, that's called intelligence sharing. That goes on all the time between great powers. During the negotiations between the USA and the Soviet Union, they shared intelligence data, right? When Nixon went to China, this is how the game is played. Intelligence is often like a bargaining chip, right? I've got some information on somebody. If you will give me blank, I will give you this information, right? This is how it's played. So is it possible that John Kerry said to the Iranians, now if you will adjust this part of the deal, I will give you some information we have about Israel and its operations in Syria? It's very possible. I don't rule it out. And we shouldn't really be shocked that that happened, right? Again, you have to remember that Israel was trying to undermine the Iran nuclear deal. Netanyahu went to Washington, D.C., and spoke to Congress, gave a speech to the U.S. Congress trying to undermine and stop the Iran nuclear deal. So Israel and the Obama administration were very strongly at odds. So is it possible that some intelligence was shared? I have no way of knowing that, but it's certainly possible. Okay. Is it easier to convince liberals than conservatives? I think so. Liberalism these days is based on the belief that there is no truth. Whereas conservatives believe in truth, they just believe in a truth that's wrong. Well, communism is also a truth, but it's the truth that's correct. It's much easier to convince somebody who believes in truth that your truth is correct than it is to convince somebody that there is no truth, right? And this is, you actually read, I've got the quote, wish I'd brought it with me, MK which is the CIA drug program. They said that drugs create a situation where you believe there is no truth and everything's a matter of opinion. Right? It's actually like that was part of the reason for MK was to break down the belief in truth. Alrighty, healthcare in China. Healthcare in China is different in different regions. In a lot of places in China, they do have like a private corporation that administers healthcare, but it's facilitated by the government. But it's actually very different in different regions. The New York Times made a horrendous video about China's healthcare system that was debunked. Nathan Rich ripped it to shreds, showing that they had intentionally mistranslated people. There's a group of people in line. And if you watched this New York Times video, you would think all these people were in line to get healthcare. They weren't. They were in line to see a specialist on the same day, right? And they lied. They lied. And that Nathan Rich just rips to shreds this anti-Chinese healthcare video. That the New York Times lied about healthcare in China for propaganda. It's disgusting that the New York Times is supposed to be this credible outlet. Is Vosh a social fascist? Is Vosh a social fascist? Well, here's the thing. The word social fascist is not a good word, right? Because nowadays, post-World War II, you think fascist, you think Hitler, you think the Holocaust, you think Mussolini, you think, mass killing and stuff like that, right? When William Z. Foster and the Communist Party USA used the term social fascist, what they meant was, there are people that speak in the name of socialism, but are actually trying to protect capitalism and mobilize violence against revolutionaries. That's what Vosh is trying to do. But the word social fascist isn't a good word. It's not a good word to use for it because Vosh is not carrying out the Holocaust. Vosh is not Hitler. Vosh is not a Nazi. Vosh is not Mussolini. Vosh is, he is a leftist in words who serves imperialism. He's a social democrat, and he is trying to mobilize people to suppress leftists. What super chat did I miss? Where's the super chat I missed? Industrial capitalism versus rentier capitalism. All right. So I wouldn't use the word social fascist versus rentier capitalism. Okay. But I mean, what William Z. Foster and the Communist Party USA were referring to when they talked about social fascism is what Vosh is doing. It's just not a good word. It's lost its meaning with time. After World War II, you can't call people social fascists anymore. It's not a good word, not a good term. So there you go. All right. And in a lot of ways, social democracy and fascism are a 1-2 punch, right? Social democracy comes first, and after social democracy fails, you get fascism. That's generally how it goes. It's a 1-2 punch, right? So first, you have social democracy, the Weimar Republic, the German Social Democratic Party, and then after social democracy doesn't solve the problem, then you get fascism, right? The ruling class tries social democracy first. After social democracy fails, they're ready for an all-out fascist state. So it's an important thing to think about. But they're not the same, ultimately, right? In Weimar Germany, you could be a communist and couldn't organize under Nazi Germany. There you go. Do I have to sing you all the song? Do I have to sing you the social fascism song? Do I have to sing you the song? Do I have to sing the song again? Do I have to sing the Cloakmakers Union song to you all? The song I always bring up. All right, I'll sing it one more time. The social fascism song of the Communist Party USA. Here goes. The Cloakmakers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union by the bosses. Those right-wing cloakmakers, they are socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hill Quits-Dubinskys and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism while they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. And the last part, just because we love it so much, encore, they preach socialism, but they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. All right, somebody rewrite the lyrics to the Cloakmakers Union song to be about Vosh, and you will make my day. Someone write the Vosh Makers Union. I don't know. Rewrite the lyrics to the Cloakmakers Union song and make them about Vosh, and you will have made my day. He preaches socialism while he practices fascism to preserve capitalism for the boss. I don't know. Somebody think of it. Somebody who's a little bit more into rhyme schemes than I am. That'd be great. Alrighty. The Bread Tubers Union. Okay. That's a good one, Char. Alrighty. All right. CEOs, do they deserve their salaries? Well, you have to remember that CEOs, most of their pay comes from stock options. All right? I mean, at the end of the day, I believe CEOs, most of their money comes from the fact that they're shareholders. They're usually shareholders in the company. Salaries are for employees generally, but CEOs, chief executive officers, often they are major shareholders. I don't think Jeff Bezos, I don't know how it works. I don't work at Amazon. I don't know their corporate structure. But generally, the shareholders elect Jeff Bezos as the CEO, but I think Jeff Bezos is himself a major stockholder. So in addition to whatever salary he's getting from Amazon, most of his money is stock options. It's like he's getting paid out what Amazon makes. He's getting, the profits. He's an owner. The reason that the reason generally given that CEO salaries are so high is because there aren't many people that can do the job, right? That's the argument, right? And that's under capitalism, that's how wages are assigned, right? Not one step backwards. Thank you, Andre. Under capitalism, wages are generally assigned, based on, is there a competition for the job? If they can find a lot of people to do the job, then the pay is low. And if the job is hard to replace, then the pay is higher. Unions can often make a difference, though. Like a union, even if the job is more easily replaceable, if it's a union job, then there can be protection. So, but CEO pay under capitalism makes sense. It's not right. I think the fact that CEOs get paid so much more than employees is certainly gross and not right. But under capitalism, it makes sense, right? We can understand why they get paid what they get paid under capitalism without justifying it, right? But we think that things like salaries and the way the means of production, these things should be rationally planned out, shouldn't be left to the chaos of the market, right? So it's not that we're opposed to wealth. It's not that we don't want anyone to ever have $1 billion, right? It's not that we want everyone to be poor, so it's fair. But at the same time, the idea is that things like CEO salaries, things like the pay of all workers, should be planned, right? Ultimately, you can't just leave important things like that to the chaos of the market. They talk about in some socialist societies, the most highly paid employees were the people, who did jobs nobody wanted, like, garbage men and stuff like that. Nobody wanted those jobs, so they got paid higher. Another thing is in Cuba, it's very common for managers to get paid less than assembly line workers. Why? Because everybody wants to be a manager, but very few people want to be assembly line workers. And so because there's more people who want to be managers because they have to do less work, the Cuban government doesn't incentivize people to become managers as much as it incentivizes people to work on the assembly line. So it's complicated. At the end of the day, are we for everyone gets paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work, like I learned in 4th grade? No. My teachers lied to me. My teachers lied to me. My teachers lied to me, and so did yours, okay? But at the same time, obviously, the fact that CEOs get paid astronomical salaries while people who work really, really hard get paid minimum wage and don't have job security and get treated like dirt on the job, that's not right, right? We can say that's not right, so there you go. Right, all right. Industrial capitalism versus rentier capitalism. I don't know what rentier capitalism is. What is rentier capitalism? Industrial capitalism no longer exists. That's the stage of capitalism before the rise of finance capital, before the rise of imperialism. But I don't know what rentier capitalism is, so I can't comment on that. And that concludes our live for tonight. Thanks, folks. It's always fun to engage with you. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.